Hi, great to have your company. You're listening to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. My name's Simon Smart.
And I'm Justine Toe.
Well, today we have in the studio, again, Scott Stephens, who is the editor of ABC Religion and Ethics website. Recommend you go to that site for amazing content. You can lose yourself there for hours. Scott is also the co-presenter with Waleed Ali of Radio National's The Minefield. Great to have you in, Scott.
Thanks, Simon.
Now, last time you were in, we talked a little bit about your childhood. It's an amazing story, this path from Cincinnati, parts of New England, New Orleans, and then to the Solomon Islands. It was a bit of a journey, wasn't it?
It really was. And in fact, if there's one way of kind of summarizing life with this wonderful, complex, hard and soft man, John Stephens. He's John Frederick Stephens III. I was very nearly John Frederick Stephens IV.
I'm very disappointed that you're not.
Me too. That actually says quite a lot about his relationship to sort of heritage. But if there's one way of kind of grasping this man, in church, my father was known as Old Testament John. I can't remember ever seeing him read from the New Testament, except from the book of James. He spent his life in the Old Testament, which was wonderful. It means that I know far more about the Old Testament than was probably good for me. But it also meant that, my father's understanding of what it means to live purely was very much shaped by the Old Testament. So dietary restrictions we followed. I was circumcised on the 8th day. Your listeners probably don't need to know that. That was very, very much. And there's also something very, how can I put this, prophetic about my father's view of God. So this was the God who also condemned sinful nations to imminent disaster. And that was one of the reasons that he felt the need to pick up the family and take us elsewhere to find a haven from the catastrophe that was going to come.
Yeah, so your family moved from Louisiana to the Solomon Islands. How old were you then? And that must have been an incredible shift for a young American boy.
Yeah, I actually, believe it or not, I never really thought of myself, and still don't even now thought of myself as American. We lived in a way that was very that was quite unrecognizable, if I can put it like that. But I was just turned 15 when we moved to the Solomon Islands. I was massively accelerated in my schooling. So when we got there, I'd already done my collegiate testing. I'd already gained university entrance as a very young man. And so it was just to kind of cap off just a little bit of schooling there in the Solomons before then moving to Australia when I had just turned 17.
What brought you here?
We met some quite extraordinary Church of England missionaries. We met them, and this probably reflected a little bit of my isolation. I just hadn't met that many interesting people in my life. But I thought these people were fabulous. There was something that was both biblically rich, but that was pastorally compelling about them. My father wanted me to return to the U.S. and to study mechanical engineering, but Dad, I don't understand science. And my mom is sort of, behind the scenes, God is calling you into ministry. God is calling you into ministry. So I knew there was something probably a little bit Jonah-like about it. He wanted me to go east. I decided to go west. He wanted me to do engineering. I decided to do theology. So it really was the prospect of coming here, of not returning to the U.S. I never wanted to return to the U.S., of coming here and studying as much as I possibly could about the Scriptures.
So, Scott, when we talked to you last time, and you've sort of hinted at this already today, you talked about the picture of God that you received as a child. Now, for all of us, that character or that image sort of develops, sometimes shifts, changes as we grow older. In what way did that happen for you?
It really is, I think, by retrospect that you really understand what was going on. But a lot of this comes from my mum. I've always loved languages. I'm one of those geeks that never, ever, ever reads an unabridged novel. As soon as I read an abridged book, I think someone's screwing me. What am I missing out on? I want to know everything. I'm one of those idiots that reads all of the footnotes because I feel like there's something lurking there. So for that reason, the thing that I really desperately, truly wanted to study were biblical languages. This is probably a bit of my father coming out. I didn't trust translations, and so I wanted to get it from the horse's mouth, as it were. And one of the wonderful, truly glorious things about Moore College is that you could study as much biblical language and as deeply as you wanted to. So I did 3 years of Greek and Hebrew. I took every Greek and Hebrew supplement that I possibly could. I did all of my exams, not with the translation, but using the first part of the exam to translate the text and to use the critical apparatus. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And it really was Hebrew and the Old Testament that I fell in love with most. One of the reasons was that there I was discovering a world that I didn't know existed. There was something in many respects, yes, terrifying, something rather exacting about the Old Testament world that I'd grown up with. But there was something that I was discovering that I just found captivating, and it really was in the figures like Isaiah and Hosea and Micah, later on in Leviticus, believe it or not, and in Exodus. I mean, there was something there. There was a kind of richness in mercy there that I had never even thought about. But richness not as something that kind of attenuates or that counters or that tempers justice or holiness, but mercy which is its truest manifestation.
It's not what many people think of when they think of the Old Testament, is it? They tend to think of the Old Testament as very judgmental, and then the New Testament you get to the lovely bits. But the Old Testament is shot through with mercy and grace, isn't it not?
There was a conversion moment for me. I mean, it really was just that. So I remember vividly coming across a book called Justice, Holiness, and Politics in the Teachings of Jesus. And I remember sitting in the corner reading this book, and he was talking about the way in which Jesus, in Luke 6:36, takes these two commands of the Old Testament. On the one hand, Leviticus 17:2. You can tell that this lives with me. I mean, I think about this almost every day. Leviticus 17:2, you shall be holy, for the Lord your God is holy. That was the motto of my early life. I mean, that was drummed into us. And then he said, look at the way that Jesus takes that and combines it with Hosea 6:6. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And then look what Jesus does with that. In Luke 6:36, you shall be merciful as your Father in heaven is merciful. And then that just began cracking things open for me. I began watching the ways as I pored back over again and again the Gospels, the way that at those very moments that you would expect Jesus to be contaminated by sin or to be affected by the uncleanness of others, Jesus isn't contaminated. Instead, his holiness rubs off on others. I mean, that was a transformative moment for me. You know, I'd grown up terrified that the world was going to rub off. And that did lead to a bit of fearfulness, not of judgment, but that I was going to screw up this vocation, that I wasn't going to be worthy of it. But at that moment, realizing that holiness's true expression is in self-giving, life-giving, outpouring, infectious mercy that doesn't get contaminated by what's out there, but transforms what's out there. That changed everything for me. It revolutionized the way that I looked at the world. It also torpedoed my plans of a future career simply studying the Old Testament. I mean, that was what I was going to end up doing.
Hence, we don't have to call you Old
Testament Scott. Can you imagine?
If you've just joined us, you're listening to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. Our guest is Scott Stephens, the editor of the ABC Religion and Ethics website, and he's telling us about his story. So, Scott, how does the position of being editor of ABC Religion and Ethics fall into this path that wasn't a path, you know, until you just kind of, did you just find your way toward it? Or
I came to this position after 5 rather unhappy years in parish ministry within the Uniting Church. That's a long story that I don't particularly want to get into, and the Uniting Church would certainly not like me to get into. It was during a period of real discernment where my wife and I were trying to work out, dear God, what next? You know, what do we do? That an invitation came to apply for this extraordinary position. And at the early stage, it was simply being a kind of umpire, being a sort of traffic cop for the ABC's already existing religion content, whether it be radio or the news stories that are derived from other sources. It was just going to become a kind of one-stop shop if you wanted to read everything that the ABC had to say about religion. I found that a pretty uninteresting prospect. I thought the ABC had far more social capital and social clout in the world. I thought they could afford to do something that was a bit more robust and theologically serious. So in my interview, I told them exactly that. And thus was the beginning of a wonderful, wonderful friendship. And I'm tremendously grateful to the ABC for taking a huge risk and in doing what no other public broadcaster in this world is willing to do, and what very few other commercial ventures are prepared to do, which is to take not just the usual suspects, the mercenaries and the self-promoters and the op-ed writers for hire, but to take the best, to take the very best theological figures in this world and to make them publicly and freely available. So for me, I mean, this is the fulfillment of a life dream. It's bringing the best and most wonderful forms of religious belief into public in the assurance that great theology isn't going to be sullied by being in the public sphere. That doesn't have to be protected. It can put up its own dukes and it can fight its way through. It can convince and it can win over hearts. And that, for me, just to go back to what we were saying before, that's mercy in action.
Scott, it is important for us to note, though, that ABC Religion and Ethics is not a Christian website, and it's not even a Christian-dominated website as well. You throw open the stage to people who are dwelling on and thinking about these big theological questions, but from different traditions.
Absolutely. And look, that I think, there is something kind of frightened, I often feel, about the way that a lot of Christians approach the public square. They often think that, Christians have a particular dog in this fight, and therefore they've got to be another one of those ideological warriors out there trying to win their case, trying to prove their point. They have to be one of the kind of table-thumping panelists on Q&A, for instance, just to make sure that the atheists at the other end of the other thing don't get the final word. That, for me, is a kind of betrayal of the Christian vocation. And if my understanding of mercy were otherwise than what it is, then I think I might myself tend to be a bit more fearful. But for me, one of the great joys, one of the revelations, has been having tremendous Muslim theologians, for instance. I think of someone like Tariq Ramadan or Khalid Abu al-Fadl or Muhammad al-Yaqubi. I mean, these are men of extraordinary, undeniable holiness, profundity, theological precision. And I think one of the things that's really exciting to me, the ABC Religion and Ethics is not Christian. It's not even predominantly Christian. It is a radically hospitable place for the best expressions of life and faith and the pursuit of God and the wonder of what does it mean to live in a holy fashion in a world like ours can get some expression. I should also say, Justine, I run this weekly radio program with a devout Muslim in Waleed Ali. If we just talked about Christianity and Islam, we would probably disagree rather a lot. But as soon as we begin talking about another issue, we find Christianity and Islam getting closer and closer and closer together. And then we discover points of agreement. One of the things I try to do on the Religion and Ethics website is to model what would robust interreligious exchange look like that's not self-defensive and that's not trying to just win the argument.
So, Scott, as you've moved to a very different environment to the one you grew up in, you've raised your own family, what are the things that you took with you and brought into your own family, and what are the things that you sort of left behind consciously?
What a wonderful question. First and most obviously, I'm a softie. I mean, an incorrigible softie.
I got that impression.
Yeah. And look, I would like to say that was a very adult decision, and it was a balanced decision. It probably wasn't. I mean, I love my father dearly, but I grew up with a tremendous sense that it was never good enough. Whatever I did was never good enough. I gush over my children. And I need to be careful of the imbalances with that as well. But for me, one of the most important things for a parent to pass on to one's child is the absolute convincedness you are utterly and completely loved. You are utterly and completely welcome no matter what. What I think I have gained, though, family is the place for the most important education. But it's not just an education in the facts or it's an education in certain mores, but it's also an enlivening of the imagination. And that, for me, was the single greatest thing that my mother did. She expanded our imaginations to create an openness. She instilled in us the unwillingness to be fearful just because we didn't understand. And so for me, I mean, that's the other, I suppose, side of the equation. The imaginative life of my children is extremely, extremely important. The final positive thing, I never had any doubt growing up that my mother and father loved each other utterly and absolutely. And so family was a safe place. There was never any fear of something breaking down between them. My son, who's in grade 12, he doesn't know a single kid at school that doesn't come from a broken family. And so that dedication, our children must never, ever worry that something's going to happen, that this safe place is ever going to turn into anything different from that.
Well, Scott Stephens, this chat has been long overdue. It's so lovely to have you in the studio. We might do it again sometime. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. For more on Christianity and modern life, please go to publicchristianity.org.
Great to have your company. We'll see you next time.